person who's learning from their mistakes.
100%.
Right?
100%.
So
Yeah.
it's important.
These are human frailty, not nothing else, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we always start this off a little bit with a little explanation about it's important that our listeners know that veterinary malpractice does happen and that it's happening more frequently than they know. And it's probably happened to most people's animals. I've witnessed it many, many times. But people often think of the word veterinary malpractice or malpractice as it needing to be something very extreme, like death. So can you define, before we get into some of these questions, so that'll help maybe guide the questions a little bit about what malpractice is and maybe the difference between malpractice and negligence?
That's for Anna.
Yes, Anna.
Sure, no problem. And veterinary malpractice, I know malpractice sounds kind of more sinister, but really it's basically veterinary negligence. It's just a different standard, because like you or I can be negligent for something. Like let's say I drop a bottle on the floor and I didn't clean it up, or I didn't do what a reasonable person would have done and clean it up, and then someone slips on it. It's my fault. I'm negligent for doing that. I didn't mean for someone to get hurt from that, but I didn't take the proper steps that I, as a regular person, should have taken to make that right, to fix the mistake I made. But with veterinarians, because they have a different level of knowledge, they have a higher level of knowledge, so they're held to a higher standard, and so they have standards of conduct, or basically, what you look at in a malpractice case is whether or not the veterinarian's conduct fell below the reasonable standards of care. So if they didn't meet those standards of care, then they're going to be, responsible. They're going to have committed an act of malpractice. Now, in the law, whether you can, be compensated, for that, or whether you can actually, do something in the civil courts depends on your damages. So it has to be that there was a breach of the standard of care, and but for that breach, your animal wouldn't have been harmed, because there's disciplinary committees that will look at standards of care and breaches, but they look at it just for the discipline, to say like, well, they didn't do this right, so maybe we should talk to them, or, find out something we can do to make them better. But when it's a person like you or I, that their animal may have been harmed by a veterinarian, then there has to be both the breach and the damages. And when you look at cases, involving veterinary malpractice, you need to have another veterinarian, of a similar kind of background, or, in that same area, because there are subspecialties and there's all sorts of different, standards, like for specialists, people who maybe hold themselves out as, maybe they're a dental specialist, or maybe they're some kind of like a cancer specialist. They're held to an even higher standard of care, or a different, standard of care that, that makes them, like if they commit a mistake, or if they make a mistake with the knowledge, they look at what a veterinarian with that same knowledge, would have done, and whether there's a breach. But, you really do have to, have that and the damages for a civil case. So that's kind of, where we're at. But what's interesting, and I know Dr. Dodds may have a kind of comment on this, but what I've seen in some of the cases we've had more recently is that general practitioner veterinarians have been trying to do things that specialists, or only specialists, should be doing. And that causes a problem, because you're still, they're still going to be held to what the specialists, at least in a lot of situations, would be held to, even though they don't have that, they don't have that knowledge, and, they shouldn't have maybe attempted something that required a specialist. But with all of this, I should say that these things vary state by state. So when you're looking at the legal analysis of it, you've got to talk to an attorney in your state, in your jurisdiction, your county, because the laws differ in how these are specifically applied. There's like general principles, and then there's a very specific application, and that's what can vary.
Yeah.
That in the several cases I've got, that we've had a very serious issue, because first of all, the people have suffered, and they've had a huge bill as well, and they're grieving, and they're gonna pay help, because that anger actually diffuses reality. And so, like you just said, it can be different states have different standards, and they say, well, that's only hearsay legally. You can't person told me, when you don't have any writing or proof that they said what they said. So the problem is it isn't that there wasn't necessarily negligence, it's that the caregiver doesn't understand the legal huge broad within the practice. Even though you and I might not do that, it's still within the defined standard within that region, for example. So I have this all the time, and I tell the people, but that's hearsay. That's legal.
Well, yeah, or here,
Right?
yeah.
Go.
Oh, I was gonna say, yeah, hearsay is, I'll explain that. It's a little tricky, that term, because hearsay really just means like an out of court statement taken for truth. Like they told me this or they told me that. But
Yes.
really more what it is it's there's a certain amount of discretion that's allowed in like a professional. So if you reach a fork in the road, like say that there's like your animal comes in, they're sick, maybe they have diarrhea, they have they're vomiting, and you say, well, they could either have this, they might have a stomach problem, or they might have something else, an underlying blood disorder. You do all the tests and it's still equally possible they could have one thing wrong or something else. If the veterinarian just picks A versus B as a course of action, and that turns out to be wrong, it doesn't mean they committed an act of malpractice simply because they made the wrong choice. It just means that
Right.
they made the wrong choice. It's actionable if most of the veterinarians, if the veterinarians, if they're like, whoa, there's no way I would have picked choice A. I would have, absolutely would have picked choice B. There were tons of things they should have looked at. They should have gone with B. That's when you go into malpractice. But the key, it's important to realize there too, is that it's not that they intended to do it wrong. It's that they made a mistake. That's what malpractice is. And it comes to be a big issue with juries also, because sometimes juries don't like to hold professionals, and I don't know why, but they don't like to hold them responsible unless it was an intentional act. And that rarely happens. It really only happens usually when somebody's trying to cover up something they did or they did wrong. But with malpractice, it's what the veterinarian typically looks at when we have to, we submit records to a veterinarian to review. They look at the actual documents from the doctors, the words themselves, the words like their records, what the veterinary doctors put down in the writing. That's what they look at. They will sometimes look at what was told to a person. So that could be hearsay, meaning that they, in a sense of like, they told me this, which is really kind of an admission against interest if it's taken as truth. But the veterinarians can look at the timeline that a client or a companion animal's guardian submits, but they look at that kind of secondarily more for things like failure to inform. But I will tell you, there have been instances where we found veterinary records that have been changed and altered, or they are not inputted the same day. That's why when we tell people the best practice is every time you go to a veterinarian, get those records that day and get them, get everything you need that day, because if something happens later, you don't necessarily have access to their computer system. You don't know how much access they have, when they can make those changes. And every time we've gotten into a legal fight over it, the attorneys representing the veterinarians in their veterinary offices do not want to tell us, the software providers. They don't want to tell us how those records are kept. And so it becomes a fight. And that's where it kind of gets tricky.
Yeah, right.
But basically, yes.
But so many people, Anna, say, I didn't know that I could get the records. And so they
Right.
pick them up. But what I'm saying about hearsay is the people are so upset and angry. What they're hearing may not be what was said. We don't know either way. I'm not supporting either side.
Right.
They said this, but they may not have understood it. When a very upset and emotional, they may not be listening to what the people are trying. The people that are trying to tell them feel like to say it. Everybody's in a stress situation. It's difficult.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, and usually, like most of the time, the records that are taken like contemporaneous for when the actions are done, those are usually taken. I wouldn't say as true, but generally is a baseline where to go. It's only when you see that the records were altered later or they weren't entered at the same time that they were taken down is when you start to question it. And that's what we've seen kind of more often. And a lot of it is because with kind of the tendency towards the corporate practice, the veterinarians have like a sheet where there's like automatic fills, in these forms that are filled out. So you'll read it and you'll be like, wait a minute, they weren't in for a spay neuter. That doesn't make any sense, or something like that. But it's an autofill form. So it kind of leads you to question, whether these vet records are accurate or not. But those are all things that the veterinarian can actually look at and say, hey, this animal's 7 years old. They were spayed back when they were 1. This is clearly not an accurate record, and they can point that out. And it's usually when we find errors in the records that it's the veterinarians who are reviewing them. But it's true. People, they may not, regular people, because like we don't, any one of us, we're not veterinarians, so we don't do this every day, and we sometimes maybe have a hard time hearing what the veterinarian's going to say to us.
Sure.
And that's why the veterinarians will write it in their records. It's only like, yeah. I see the worst of it. So I think like my perception of it is a bit more skewed. So
let me really quickly, for our listeners, I'm just going to give some people are new listening to this. This is live all over Instagram and Facebook pages everywhere. So Joey's Legacy, really quick, is an organization that was formed from the loss of a little dachshund named Joey, who lost his life due to veterinary malpractice. The owner of Joey started this organization called Joey's Legacy. And what Joey's Legacy does is it brings together veterinarians and attorneys and pet parents who may have been victims of veterinary malpractice. How it works is you would initially send in what you think may have happened, and one of our veterinarians, like Dr. Jean Dodds, would review it, look at it to see if the standard, which is what Anna, our attorney, was talking about, was the standard of care not where it should be. So Dr. Dodds would be able to look at that and say, oh yeah, I wouldn't, as Anna was explaining, have done B, I would have done A, and this is what I would have done. And then once that happens, and one of the veterinarians says, yeah, this looks like it might be veterinary malpractice, it gets sent over to our attorneys, and that's when the attorneys take over. So that's what Joey's Legacy does. And that's why we're here. This is why this organization has been put together. As Dr. Dodds has mentioned, I have said many times on the show, I've witnessed veterinary malpractice back in my days as a vet tech, and every single veterinarian that's in this organization has seen it. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you, Dr. Dodds, is your opinion on why do you think veterinarian malpractice? One of the things that Anna had said is that it's really rare that no one's going purposely out of their way to do veterinary malpractice. Why do you think it happens? What do you think, or maybe, I think there's lots of reasons, but what do you think the main reason why we're continuing?
Well, I think with the effect of the pandemic, all our lives have changed. And so many veterinarians could not actually directly see the pet and the pet caregiver at the same time. The technician comes out and gives them a recommendation, brings the animal into the clinic. The veterinarian or veterinarians examine the animal. Sometimes the veterinarian's got an emergency. A technician is examining them. They're talking about it. They come out to the pet care, say, this is what we think it is. This is what it's going to be. We're told. You have to be able to see someone and look at them directly. Look at the pet. I mean, we're an emergency medical able. We've never closed. We've always allowed to have pets come in, and when we couldn't come in, we had a canopy outside in the parking lot, and the pet was with us the whole time with our veterinarians, but a special facility. So we were lucky in that regard, in that we were always able to look at people and tell them what to do. Some people that said, I hear what you say, like vaccine, believe in vaccines, so I'm not going to do it. So wait a minute, parvovirus epidemic, and we don't believe in vaccines. I'm okay with it, but my wife won't. So I said, okay, so do we fire that client? Do we tell, we get the information, we tell them, 2 months later, they say, okay, we've changed our mind, we'll come in to get the vaccines. They never kept the appointment.
Yeah.
We feel terrible for that puppy. You know, these people have been themselves that affects another living being. God forbid a child or another animal, right? And won't follow what we all know is the standard of practice.
Well, I think a lot of times what happens, in that this all or nothing world that we live in. And so when someone like Dr. Dodds says, and correct me if I'm wrong, if Dr. Dodds says, you know, the Bordetella vaccine is not a good idea, and then they take that as a whole for every vaccine is not a good idea.
Yeah,
And it really is a case by case situation.
absolutely.
Right.
So
Without commenting about the clinically critical disease, virus and rabies by law.
right.